You already think you know the Pony Express. Gamblers on horseback, dusty relay posts, a young republic shouting letters across the plains. That's the version. Gallant, romantic, American. You don't know it yet. Most people don't. Here's the problem. The real story of the Pony Express isn't in the riders. It's not really even in the horses. It's in the small, wooden way stations that sat 10 to 15 miles apart across 1,966 miles of empty country. The boxes on the map that almost no one asks about. Each one owned, fed, staffed, and bled money on a daily basis. Cost economics nobody ran. So here's what nobody told you. The Pony Express didn't fail on the trail. It failed once a month, at every station, in the cost of keeping a horse alive. Let that one settle for a moment. The single most expensive line item of the entire enterprise wasn't the rider's pay. It wasn't the mail pouch. It was hay. By any conventional analysis, a private express company charging customers $5 for half an ounce of mail, the equivalent of roughly $130 in modern money, should have made a fortune. By any conventional analysis, the company behind it should have made money for years. It didn't. Which brings us to the station. Not the famous ones. The hundreds of ordinary ones you drove past on the way to somewhere else. The way you have driven past them for the last 160 years. So how much did it actually cost to own one? To answer that, you have to understand what already existed before the Pony Express was even a sketch on a barroom napkin in April of 1860. Context. The firm behind the route was not, strictly speaking, a mail company. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, three businessmen from the Missouri border, ran a freight operation. Their business was hauling government supplies, civilian goods, and military freight across the plains to army forts and mining camps. The firm moved tonnage. Wagons, mules, oxen. Their existing infrastructure included a thin string of supply depots already spaced across the route from Missouri to California, originally built to support the freighting business. By 1860, Russell's partners had access to roughly 50 existing stations and could leverage earlier government freight contracts to underwrite some of the startup capital. Then came a different kind of pressure. The existing overland mail contract was held by John Butterfield, whose southern route ran down through Texas and the Southwest. That route avoided the Central Plains entirely. It was slow, roughly 25 days end to end. Politicians in Washington and certain newspapers in California wanted a faster Central Corridor, and they wanted it before the November election of 1860. Russell's partners sensed the opportunity. They believed the government would eventually subsidize the line once it was running, the way it had subsidized Butterfield. The political calculation drove the financial one. That order matters. So where does the money actually come from? And where does it actually go? To answer that, you have to apply one simple frame to every station on the route. Every station had three cost pillars: stock, the horses themselves, sustain, feed, water, and shelter, and service, the humans, riders and station keepers and farriers, paid in cash and fed in kind. Mail revenue came in only once a day, in two directions, on a fixed schedule. The story is the gap between the two. Which brings us to the stations themselves. There were roughly 150 of them. Give or take a handful. Most of what we'd call bookkeeping, the cost of running a Pony Express station, comes down to a relay station, the smaller kind. Relay stations sat 10 to 15 miles apart, so a rider could swap his horse at full gallop, 2 minutes in and out. The horse was the cargo. Everything at the station existed to make that 2-minute swap possible. A typical relay station, in 1860, kept between 8 and 14 horses on hand, fresh, watered, ready. Sources vary, but the National Park Service estimates the entire line carried 400 to 500 animals across its 18 months of operation. So if your station sat in the middle of the route and the line peaks at 500 horses, your small piece of that herd was somewhere in that range. The first pillar, stock. The horses were bought. They were not free. The company purchased thoroughbreds for the eastern runs and California Mustangs for the western stretches, paying cash up front. Average horse price in the period, on the open trail market, ran between $150 and $200 per head. Lower for Mustangs. Higher for blooded stock. A relay station carrying 10 replacement horses held roughly $1,500 in animal inventory at any given moment. That wasn't a capital expense that depreciated slowly. It depreciated weekly. Horses died. Horses bolted. Horses went lame and never recovered. Horses were stolen by hostiles. Government records from the period suggest the company replaced its herd multiple times over the 18-month run. The second pillar: sustain. Feed. This is where the quiet drain lived. A single horse in heavy relay use in 1860 consumed somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds of hay per day, plus oats, plus salt, plus water. Per day. Multiply by 10 horses at your station. That was 150 to 200 pounds of hay daily. In $1860, hay at frontier pricing was roughly $15 to $20 a ton. The arithmetic: a single 10-horse station spent, on feed alone, somewhere between $100 and $150 per month. That number is not adjusted for inflation. That is the actual logbook number, in $1860. Yes, more than the rider's wages. The third pillar: service. A station keeper was the man who actually ran your box. He was paid cash, modest cash, usually a small monthly stipend the records describe as ranging somewhere between $25 and $50, depending on the source and the location. He was also fed by the operation. He was also armed. Sometimes he was the only armed man in a 30-mile radius. He also had to keep the horses ready for a rider who might appear in daylight, at night, in a snowstorm, with a fresh horse expected inside 2 minutes. He also had to keep books, accurate daily records of every saddle and rider who came through. Per government inspection, the station keeper's basic duty was the immediate saddle readiness of a change horse for an incoming rider and the maintenance of accurate records. The rider himself was paid separately. Sources differ on the figure, but the standard number cited by historians of the Pony Express, including the firm's own advertisements and later pension office testimony from surviving riders, is roughly $100 per month for top riders, with a starting rate closer to $50. By any reasonable comparison to frontier wages of the era, where a laborer might earn 40 cents a day, that was high pay. It had to be. A rider covered 75 to 100 miles per stretch, day or night, weather permitting, on a single horse between home stations where he actually slept. Home stations, the larger ones, spaced roughly 90 miles apart, kept a different cost structure. A rider arrived, slept, ate, and left with a fresh horse in the morning. These stations often held 20 to 40 horses, fed more men, and represented the firm's principal lodging infrastructure. They were not offices. They were hostels with a saddle. So you stack the 3 pillars at a relay station. 10 horses at the feed numbers above. 1 keeper plus occasional hired hands. A modest stipend for him, larger in kind. Feed costs dominated everything. But that's a partial list. Add in stable repairs. Wooden corrals on the plains didn't last. Add in tools. Saddles wore out, bridles broke, hooves needed shoes. Add in the feed for the keeper's own riding horse, since he wasn't always foot mobile. Add in transport costs for moving feed forward from depots, because hay didn't grow uniformly along the route. By any conventional ledger, a single relay station in 1860 carried a monthly operating expense somewhere between $200 and $300 before the rider's wages were even counted. That's the number to remember: $200 to $300 per month, per station, times 150 stations. Which brings us, slowly, because this is the part that takes the longest to absorb, to mail volume. Mail revenue came in only one way: letters. Each letter cost the customer $5 per half ounce at the start of the run in April of 1860. By summer, the company slashed the rate to $2.50. By the end, it had dropped to $1 per half ounce. The reductions were forced. Volume wasn't meeting the operating cost, so they cut the price to try to fill seats. The total mail carried across the entire 18-month run is estimated at roughly 35,000 pieces. That number covers letters, telegraphic dispatches, and newspapers, in both directions, total. So a useful rule of thumb: maybe 1,966 mailings per month across the entire northern corridor, divided unevenly across the stations by traffic count. Wait, hold on that number. 1,966 mailings per month. And remember, that's gross mailings, not gross weight of paying matter, and the western traffic was always lighter than the eastern. A conservative revenue estimate, using a blended rate of about $2 per letter over the run, 35,000 pieces times $2 equals $70,000. That's a gross revenue estimate. Some sources cite a higher gross of around $90,000 from start to end of operation. Pick the higher figure, $90,000, against operating expenses. The Pony Express firm, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, sank their larger freight business into the line as seed capital, borrowed against future government contracts they had been informally promised, and waited. The waited part is the operative verb. Reimbursement from the federal government never arrived in the form the firm's partners had been led to expect. By any conventional analysis, and several historians, including the National Park Service's Historic Resource Study, have run this arithmetic. The line lost money on every single letter it carried. Britannica's estimate puts the per letter loss at about $13. Other estimates are lower, around $7 to $10. None are positive. Take the middle figure, $10 lost on every letter. Multiply 35,000 pieces times $10 per letter lost. Roughly $350,000 of operating shortfall across 18 months. Adjusted for inflation, that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million modern dollars. The figure most commonly cited in the historical record for the firm's out-of-pocket losses is $200,000. Some sources run higher. The boards of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, by the end of 1861, were functionally insolvent. Then came October 24, 1861. The Transcontinental Telegraph. The first message pulsed across the wire from Sacramento East. Telegraph was instant. Telegraph was cheap. There was no longer any economic reason for a one-week horse relay to exist. The line kept running for a few weeks after the wire was completed, mostly to clear the in-transit backlog. Then it was shut down. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, the partners who had absorbed the cost and waited for that government subsidy that never materialized, were effectively ruined. Some of the principals were indicted in later years over related freight contract irregularities. The company's collapse cascaded into other Russell ventures. By 1865, the firm's freight arm was in federal receivership. Rigid rule, hard constraint. A telegraph wire costs almost nothing to operate per message sent. A horse costs hay. Every hour it is alive. So the turning point is not what people usually describe. The story is not that the telegraph killed the Pony Express. The telegraph exposed an economic structure that was never viable in the first place. The line had been bleeding capital since April 3, 1860. October 1861 was not the killing blow. It was the discovery of the body. The Pony Express only ran long enough to prove that the old formula, government subsidy waiting in the wings, had failed to arrive. Here's what nobody told you. Restated. The station was the loss. Not the rider, not the route, not even the herd as a whole. The single relay box on the prairie, with its 10 horses and its hay bill and its one keeper with a rifle. That was where the firm's cash went to die, every month, on every one of 140 stations, for 18 months. Which brings us to the human layer. The station keeper. In Nevada, in Utah, in the Sweetwater, at the summit of the Rockies. A man with a station diary, a ledger, sometimes a wife and children in a one-room cabin behind the corral. The firm paid him partly in cash, partly in trade, partly in credit at company stores. When the line shut down in 1861, those station keepers, many of whom had spent a year and a half with no other real income, were simply dismissed, in many cases without the back wages owed. Some of the home station keepers later applied for federal pensions on the grounds that their service constituted wartime quasi-military support. The pension office recognized a handful of claims and rejected many more. The riders, they knew what they had signed up for. Pay was high precisely because death was routine. The historical record counts at least 7 riders killed en route, and the actual number is probably higher. Horses dropped. Riders were caught in blizzards in the Sierra Nevada. Riders were ambushed in the Central Plains during the Paiute War of 1860, which cost the company at least $75,000 in property losses. There is that number again, and an unknown number of lives among station keepers, wranglers, and stock tenders who are not on the famous rider rolls. $60,000 in property losses during wartime, restated. $60,000 was, by itself, 2/3 of the entire gross revenue of the line at its full operating rate. The partners, William Russell, Alexander Majors, William Waddell, 3 names on a freight bill. Russell's personal finances collapsed with the firm's. He was later implicated in the Star Route postal scandals, and other federal contracting controversies. Majors carried the freight arm through federal receivership. Waddell largely disappeared from public record. 3 businessmen who had moved canvas and oxen across the plains entered the mail business as a sideline. The sideline swallowed the firm. The lesson is not about horses. The lesson is not about brave young men on saddles. The lesson is about what happens when a business assumes future revenue that does not arrive and then builds daily operating expenses against that assumed revenue. The station was a daily operating expense. The horses were a daily operating expense. The hay was a daily operating expense. The expected government payment was the only thing kept on the books as the offset. When it didn't arrive, and once the telegraph arrived, it never could, the entire structure collapsed, station by station, ledger by ledger. By any conventional analysis, the Pony Express should have been profitable. It was a monopoly on a route everyone agreed was necessary. It charged monopoly prices. It moved high-value cargo. It should have worked. It didn't. The discrepancy between what should have been profitable and what was structurally broken is the same discrepancy. And this is the quiet warning that quietly burns down any number of businesses today. The kind that keep paying daily costs against a contract or revenue stream that someone, somewhere, is fairly sure will arrive. The cost compounds. The revenue does not. The ledger exits look fine for a long time, and then they don't. The Pony Express lasted 18 months. The relay stations on the prairie are mostly gone now, replaced by ranch houses, parking lots, and interstate highway rest stops. A few still stand as museum ruins, leaning into the wind. Nearly 200 of them, at one time or another, lost money on behalf of a firm that no longer existed, fed a herd of horses that no longer carried mail, paid a keeper who no longer had a station to run. Not a single one of those stations turned a profit. By any conventional analysis, exactly one of them should have. None did. Which is the lesson? The lesson is that an enterprise can be needed, can be real, can do actual important work in the actual world, can carry actual letters between actual people, and still not be a business. It can just be a cost, compounded daily, until it stops. And the reminder, quiet and worth keeping, is that the distance between those two outcomes is almost always a small line item in a ledger no one outside the firm is looking at. Hey, mostly. Just hey.